Welcome to a special presentation of The Library Show. This episode is all about stories and storytelling. On July 22nd, the Shelby Township Library hosted storyteller Jenifer Strauss, a narrative consultant who over the years has used stories to capture interest and motivate learning in both children and adults. Storytelling has a rich history in many cultures, and Jenifer is one of the best at weaving and presenting these tales. The reason we have waited to air this special episode is because Jenifer's program is perfect for Halloween. So, after a short video introduction to Jenifer from her own website, storybetold.com, we are going to hear her presentation of Haunted Tales of the Great Lakes.
My name is Jenifer Strauss, and I'm a narrative consultant. I use story or narrative to help educators, organizations, and individuals connect, communicate, and achieve their goals. For generations, the human brain has been hardwired for story. We think, learn, and retain information in images that we translate into meaning. That means we process information better if it's delivered in narrative or story form. We remember information better if there is a clear beginning, middle, and end, if there is a problem and a solution, or if an important lesson is conveyed. Over time, the way that stories are told has changed, from cave paintings to spoken word, from printed material to diverse digital media. But one thing all humans share is that storytelling is, and always has been, our universal language. Every day, in formal and informal ways, we all tell stories. It is through story that we communicate our experiences, opinions, and our desires. If you tell a good story, people will connect with you, your product, or your mission. That is why in every area of my consulting business, the common denominator is story. For over 20 years, I've been sharing stories with a vast variety of audiences in a multitude of places across the United States, where I give performances, trainings, and keynotes, always using story to help my clients clarify and achieve their goals. But I started to understand the power of story very early in my career. My first job was teaching environmental science to inner-city students in an outdoor classroom. I was challenged with helping them understand big ecological concepts. I told my students stories about plants and animals. I told them myths and legends about the sun, the stars, and the moon. These traditional stories created a mental file folder for my students and provided the connection they needed to hold on to the new ecological concepts they were learning. During my 10 years as a classroom teacher, it was a class of 6th graders who taught me about the power of narrative. Many of them were struggling with reading and writing. I started to tell daily stories that were connected to our curriculum. I allowed my students to tell their stories out loud before writing them down. By orally writing and editing their rough drafts, they could approach the writing process with more confidence and ease. The Turning Point's personal narrative process was born out of my work with those students. For over 2 decades, I have used the Turning Points process in my consulting business. So if you are an educator who wants to motivate and inspire your students as writers, an organization who wants to communicate your mission to clients, patrons, and donors, a business who wants to tell the story of your product or service, improve internal staff relationships, or conceptualize a business strategy, or if you are an individual who wants to make positive life changes, improve your parenting skills, or clarify personal goals, Story Be Told can help you tell your story. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out this evening to hear some haunted tales from the shores of our wonderful state, Michigan. I came from Traverse City, but actually came down on Monday. I've been in the area all week and telling in libraries for the summer reading program. Tomorrow I will spend my day, a 3rd day, in the city of Detroit at a school called Caden Special Education Center, where I will share stories with children of all abilities. So it's great to be home. Detroit is my home, and it's where I was raised. And so when I come home, it feels like coming home. And when I got to my hotel today, I bought a I'm from Detroit girl t-shirt. Because Detroit is coming back, have you noticed? And it really excites me to see all the changes that are happening in a city that had a lot of problems for a long time. So it's good to be home, and I'm glad you've come to gather with me tonight to share what is some of my favorite stories, and those are the stories from Michigan, but especially the haunted tales. And in the first story, I will explain to you how I became obsessed with the haunted tales from Michigan. I'm going to start by getting us in the mood tonight with a poem that I wrote about Michigan years ago to try and capture some of the feeling that I have about living in this incredible state, surrounded by water, covered in woods, an incredible place of resources and people. And the poem goes like this. A familiar rocky shoreline, sandy beaches, balsam fir, green spires pointing skyward into blue in Michigan, the Northland. A loon call, waking me from sleep, staring up at dark jeweled skies in Michigan, the Northland. Northern lights, streaks of color dancing across the sky as I whistle a tune for them in Michigan, the Northland. A canoe paddle, hold firmly in my hands from the stern of a fully loaded canoe, traveling old fur trade routes in Michigan, the Northland. A field filled with colors from knapweed and fireweed, picking thimbleberries on the few warm days of summer in the north, in Michigan, the Northland. A hint of amber and gold in the leaves of maple and birch, reminding us of winter's return in August. In Michigan, the Northland. A journey on snowshoes through inches of freshly fallen powder, hauling sleds with wood for fires to warm us in Michigan, the Northland. A hot sauna, or if you're from really up north, sauna, burning. Steam rising from the rocks, soothing aching muscles from a day's work in the woods in Michigan, the Northland. A sunset on Superior, Gitche Gumee, the great one. Oarboats moving in the distance, falling asleep on a bed of sand in Michigan, the Northland. Stories to be told of the people of this place, the Anishinabeg, of miners and loggers, of lighthouses and ships, immigrant lives made new with hope in Michigan, the Northland. A deep reunion each time I go, with memories made and yet to be. A quiet comfort settles in. My final destiny, Michigan, the Northland. How many people could relate to any of the stanzas of that poem? All right. It is a special place. So I'm going to start tonight with a true story. The rest you're going to have to decide for yourself. I always say that every story has some truth, but not all the parts necessarily have to be true. This story is a true one. I will hold the lantern up so everyone can see it as I tell this story. An incredible old square wooden lamp, if you can't see what it's made out from where you're sitting, and glass that slides up through slits in the sides of the wood, and pegs that hold this lantern together, and a peg that raises the candle. A simple design. I'd like to tell you the story, and this has become the symbol of my work over the last 23 years. Let a story be told. Let a story be heard. And let a story be told again. It was many years ago when I was still a teacher. I had something really wonderful back in those days. It was called summer vacation. Because I was a teacher and I didn't have to work in the summer, I never stayed home. In fact, I always planned an incredible adventure. And one year I was sitting on my porch on the day after school let out at 8 o'clock in the morning when I could have slept in. Cup of coffee in my hand, porch chairs out on the porch for the first time that season. I was watching all my neighbors go to work. I was wishing them well. Have a nice day. And when it got quiet on the road out in front of my house, I started to plan that summer's adventure. And I decided that I was going to load all my camping gear up into the back of my old red rusty Ford truck in hopes that it would make the journey. I was going to travel over the Mackinac Bridge and camp out in a different place every night that summer. I opened the back of that truck and loaded it with sleeping bag and tent, Coleman stove, the old kind with the pump gas, right? My lantern, not this one yet. Bug spray, a box with nothing else in it but graham crackers, oh yeah. Marshmallows, and chocolate bars. With everything I needed, I shut the back of that truck and I got in and started the adventure of the summer. And up and over the Mackinac Bridge on a day like today when there were sparkles on the waters of the Straits of Mackinac, an iron ore boat moving under the bridge while I was traveling over and into the land of green pointy trees and adventures as I had come to know it. I started to camp out in some amazing places, the Pictured Rocks National Shoreline, Bay Furnace, all the way across that state by the waters, in the woods, by waterfalls and rivers, until 3 weeks into this trip and late one afternoon, I was traveling up the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan, copper country as we know it. I had seen the name of a town on the map. I thought it was an interesting name for a town. The town was called Amique. I was traveling thinking the name of that town had some rhythm. Amique, Amique. It seemed to go well with the rumbling of my old truck engine. Amique, Amique. I had no idea it was the Anishinaabe word for the animal beaver, and the name of that town made sense from its early history. The town of Amique, a copper mining town. By the time I drove through on this trip, a Michigan ghost town. For those mines had been shut down for a long time. And when I drove through Amique, I realized it was a quiet town with boarded up houses, row houses, those mining houses. With boarded up businesses because they could no longer survive. Everyone who worked in those mines had to leave to find jobs in other places. And an old mine shaft in the distance that said, danger, keep out. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I drove through that town with the intent of driving through and heading to a place called Fort Wilkins State Park, where I would camp that night and learn more of Michigan history. When I saw on the north end of town an antique store that was still open. I love antique stores. I don't know about you, but I can barely drive by one without stopping, especially in the Upper Peninsula. I drove in, pulled the truck up, and I walked in, and this place had ceilings that were low and lights that were dim, and it was like a Michigan museum filled with incredible old things like miners' helmets, but not with a battery pack, but instead a place for a candle. Many layered metal lunch boxes that the miners used to take their lunches underground because they weren't coming up for a lunch break. Big, heavy red and black plaid hunting clothes that the men wore in the woods in the old days to stay warm, and I'm not quite sure how they maneuvered in the woods in those clothes. And the back wall was nearly wallpapered with crosscut saws that took 2 men to cut a tree down. I came around a corner in that store and I spotted this lantern for the very first time, and I was drawn to it right away, and I very carefully took it down off the iron hook where it was hanging, and I was holding it in my hands, wondering where it came from, wondering how old it was, and I must have looked at the lamp a little bit too long because the man who owned that store came over to talk to me. I thought I was going to get a sales pitch when he came over, but that isn't what happened in the store that day. He came over, but he didn't stop in that usual place where people stop when they don't know you very well. He was standing so close to me that I felt incredibly uncomfortable, and I leaned back and said, "How you doing?" When I leaned back, I saw a much older man about the same height that I was, with white, gray, wispy hair sticking out of the sides of his head. No hair on the top of his head. In fact, a gentle glow was coming from his bald spot. Back up to the ceilings in the low light that was right above him. A pair of reading glasses sitting down on the tip of his nose. A pair of old blue jean work pants that were hanging down so low that it made me a little nervous. Now, I wondered why his pants were hanging like this, because it was long before it was fashionable to wear your pants hanging in the back with your underwear showing. And I don't think the man that owned this store ever cared if he made a fashion statement ever in his life. Then I realized he was an older man. The store, well, he had sat around it for many years. He had time to talk to everyone who came in, including me. Because he was older and had sat around that store for some years, he had an endearing little pot belly that stuck out in front. I imagine that he purchased those work pants long before he had the belly, but he was still wearing them. And that's why they were hanging so low. And the only thing holding up those pants were a pair of wide red suspenders from the 70s. Remember those? My dad wore them. I didn't let my friends come over on those days. The only thing holding up his pants. And at one point, I knew this to be true because he turned around to get something off the table behind us. And I was greeted by what I affectionately refer to now as a vertical smile. I was really happy when he turned back around again. We talked, the usual where you froms and where you goings, and then he looked at me with his hands on his hips over those glasses that were perched on his nose, and he said, "So, you like my lufta, don't you?" After what I had just seen, I looked at him and said, "I like your what?" He said, "You like my lufta, don't you?" I said, "Are you talking about the lamp?" He said, "Oh, yes." I said, "Can you tell me anything about it? It caught my eye when I came into your store. How old is it?" I was still holding on to the lamp at the time, and he took it out of my hands, put it down on the table next to us, and told me that he couldn't speak about this lamp until he lit the candle that was still inside. He said it came from a family. Their last name was Koivula. The Koivula family came from Finland. Someone in their family had made this lamp many years ago, and they moved to Michigan to work in those copper mines, as so many Finnish people did. And when they came to Michigan, they brought the lamp with them. I asked him why it was so important that this family would bring a lamp all the way from Finland on such a long journey, and he told me what their tradition was. On cold winter nights, as many of those in Finland as there is in the Upper Peninsula, they would wait until it got dark outside the windows of their house, and the 7 Koivula children would run through the house and turn off all the lights. And when it was dark in that house, their mom knew what to do, and she would come down into the living room where they kept the lamp, and she would light the candle. With the lights off and the candle lit, everyone else knew what to do, and those 7 kids would come tumbling down the steps because they were excited. Dad would come in, and they would wait for Grandpa to come from his room upstairs, all the way down the steps until he took his chair, he said, because they would never start without Grandpa. And on those cold winter nights in the dark with only the candle lit, no cell phones to turn off, no screens to distract, they would sit close together and tell each other, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I looked up at the man who owned this store and I said, "Are you just telling me this? You're just trying to get me to buy that lamp?" And he said, "Oh no, they did that for 150 years. So I had to ask him, why is the lantern in your store and why are they not still doing that?" And he told me the end of this story, and it was incredibly sad, but I knew, like I've known so often, that I was in the right place at the right time, and I better be paying attention. The 7 children in the Koivula family were a bit spread out in age, 5 being older and 2 latecomers to the family. The older children had left home, leaving those 2 boys at home a little bit longer, but they eventually left the town of Amik and moved to Lower Michigan to get jobs. With the children gone, Mom and Dad moved into a smaller house in the town of Calumet. Grandpa lived in the old family house until he passed away. When Grandpa was gone, so were many of the family traditions. Family members coming north to visit less and less, The lamp ended up in the attic of that house for several years, as that house sat empty until one year they sold the house, had an auction, got rid of all the things inside the house that they didn't want, including the lamp. I suspect that if there had been, and I'm sorry for the men in the audience, more girls in that family than boys, because 6 out of those 7 kids were boys, that this may not have happened. Women tend to be greater keepers of tradition in families. They let go of this lamp because no one thought it was important any longer. And when I heard that 150 years of stories were told around this lamp in Finland and in Michigan, I looked up at the man who owned that store and said, "You have to let me buy that. I'm not leaving the store until you let me buy that lamp." And he looked at me over those glasses and said, "What are you going to do with it?" And I said, "I'm going to light it, and I'm going to tell stories with kids." He got a slow and steady smile that spread across his face, and he looked at me and said, "I think that's a really good idea." I bought the lamp that day and walked out of the store, but not with just a lamp. An incredible story that I've been telling ever since that day that connects us from our past to the very present day while we sit in this room listening to stories that may guide us into the future in a different way. It connects us, those traditions. And so I light the candle each time in honor of traditions that are much too important to let go of, like simply listening to stories in a room together at night around the light of a candle. Now, the word that he used, I couldn't let go. When he called it lufta, I had to turn around before I left the store, and I asked him, "What is that word?" He told me it's a word in Finnish, and it means lantern, and he asked me to say it. It came out like this, lufta. He said, "Oh, you need some help." And he walked over and grabbed my face with his hand like this. He said, "The only way you can talk like a Finn, if you're not a Finn, is if I do this to you. Now try it again." Roofta. He said, "Now you're talking like a Finn." So on the count of 3, I want you to grab your face, not somebody else's face. We're going to say luta, and it should sound really mushy in your mouth. Let me say it again. Luta, luta. So let's try it. 1, 2, 3. Luta. Now you're talking like a Finn. All right. The stories that I tell, especially the haunted tales, I pick very carefully. They have to have a meaning for me. They have to bring some message to me. I never tell scary stories to children and leave them unsafe at the end. There's always a reason for telling a story. The first time I heard this story, I was 16 years old. I paid attention then, but when I became a storyteller, I went back to those stories that grabbed a hold of me when I was young, and I made sure that those were some of the stories that ended up in my repertoire. This is one of those. Let a story be told, let a story be heard, and let a story be told again. It was long ago beside Lake Huron, upon those sandy shores, but the voice of one sweet Minnie Quay will be heard there forevermore. Sailors out on the waters of Lake Huron can still hear her. Couples walking on the beach can hear her too. Sometimes she will call for you to follow her into those waters icy blue. If you were to travel on the Michigan-Huron side, up Highway 25, just 4 miles out of the town of Port Sanilac, you come to a place on the road where there are still boarded up buildings on both sides of the road. The sands blown by the wind over the years have covered the bottom of some of those boarded up buildings, but if you stand close enough, you can still see what they were. There was a general store with a post office on the back side. Across the street, there was a great big hotel known as the Tanner House Hotel. Never a vacancy during the peak of the lumber era in Michigan. Next to the Tanner House Hotel, there is a building that's not boarded up. It's a house, a very impressive 2-story blue wooden house. It's become a bed and breakfast in more recent times, but if you walk up to that house and you look above the door, you'll see the year 1852 and the name Quay. And in that house, they say there lived a girl by the name of Minnie Quay, who lived in the town of Forester, Michigan, many years ago, whose life came to a terrible end. The town and all that's left of it is Forester. If you check the books to this very day, they never became incorporated because it was one of those boom and bust towns, like so many in Michigan during the lumber era. It came and went so quickly, there wasn't time for incorporation. In the old days, over 500 people lived in that town, warehouses down by Lake Huron, a long pier that went out into the water where the freighters would come, sail ships at first, steamers a little bit later, to load up with wood to take to other places during the peak of the lumber era when that wood was needed to build so many things in this country. Now, I had never heard of Minnie Quay, or the fact that the people of Forester to this very day will tell you that her ghost still haunts the beaches, the woods, and their town. I grew up in Detroit. It's not that far to get to the Lake Huron shore, as we all know. You're a little closer here. I grew up in Detroit, but had never heard any stories about a haunted town or a girl named Minnie Quay, not until one day during high school. It was October, and the Detroit Free Press had run a special article written by a woman who wrote for the Free Press in those days. Her name was Marion Cucklow. Anybody remember her? She called herself a green witch, and they still let her write for the Free Press. Marion Cucklow decided to research all the haunted places in Michigan that you could visit if you wanted to. And in this story in the Free Press that morning were all the places that were haunted in the city of Detroit and beyond. My father was reading the Free Press that morning at breakfast, as he always did, and I suppose I got my love for haunted tales from him because my dad was obsessed with anything that had to do with the paranormal, ghost sightings, or haunted places. That morning he read the article that Marion Cucklow had written. He got up from the table where my sisters and I were eating breakfast, my mother packing lunches for us back in the day when your mom still packed you lunches. He went to the drawer in the kitchen where we kept our scissors and brought the scissors back to the table and started cutting that article out of the Free Press. My mom looked up from making sandwiches and said, "What are you doing?" My dad held the article up in her face and said, "Sounds like some great vacation ideas, don't you think?" My mom just rolled her eyes. She did that a lot to my father. He took the article and folded it up. My sisters and I were elbowing each other at the table, wondering if we would ever go on a vacation to a haunted town and how wonderful that would be. He put it in the manila envelope where he cut all the strange and weird articles that he would save from the Free Press. It stayed in that manila envelope until spring break in April, because that was the time when my family always started to plan our summer reunion with our family. Our summer reunion was always the first week of August. We always went over to the Lake Michigan shore, rented cabins around a lake called Crystal Lake, and that was always where our family would gather in the summertime. That April, when my mother got on the phone to make those reservations and call my family to make plans, my dad got the article back out of the envelope and held it up again and said, "Why don't we try something different?" My mom said, "Oh no, we're not going to do that. We've always vacationed on Crystal Lake. We're going to keep doing that." But just like every time when you're trying to convince one family member to change their mind and all the other family members are working on that one person, we all worked on my mom and she caved in. She agreed that we would camp and have our family reunion that summer in a town called Forester, Michigan, a haunted town on the Lake Huron shore. My mom got on the phone to tell my relatives in Fort Wayne, Indiana, that our plans had changed for that year. My aunts and uncles thought the change would do us some good. My cousins were all excited about camping in a haunted town that year. And my Uncle Fred, the oldest brother, the one who spent 20 years in the Navy, the one who didn't get married until he was 60 and married a woman who was 38 years old. My Uncle Fred heard that we were going to be camping in a haunted town and started to make his own plans for our vacation that year. It was an anxious wait until the first week of August that year. But finally it arrived, and our relatives drove up from Fort Wayne, Indiana, spent the night, and we packed up all those station wagons, with blankets and comic books and everything you would need for a vacation. Kids piled in, no seatbelts, oh my goodness, laying on blankets and pillows in the back of the station wagon with the back window rolled down. On our way to the Lake Huron shore, kids were all excited because we didn't have to spend 4 hours in the car. It was a much shorter journey to get to Forester than it was to Crystal Lake. We got out and we started to pile into the cabins that we had rented in Forester. The cousins were all excited because we got our own cabins. The grown-ups were happy because they got their own cabins. Everyone thought it was a good deal. Once we were unpacked, we started to do what you would do on those summer vacations on one of the Great Lakes in Michigan. We swam in the August warm waters of Lake Huron. We had those big foil reflectors under our chins and baby oil slathered all over us so that we could get a really good tan. Weren't we foolish in those days? But we had great tans. We would play volleyball on the beach and in the water, and then as the sun started to set, my uncles would start to make the fire down by the water that we would cook our dinner on. Those foil dinners, have you had them? Where you put hamburger and vegetables and cheese and everything into that same piece of foil, and it looks really disgusting. But when it comes out of the fire, it's the best meal you've ever had because you're outside and you're camping with your family. Easy cleanup. And when dinner was over, the first night of our vacation, we would pull our blankets and lawn chairs closer to the fire to listen to stories that my Uncle Len would tell. He was the best at telling scary stories, and it didn't matter whether we heard them every year. He could still make us jump at the right places. He told stories like the monkey's paw. He told stories like, who stole my golden arm? And he would sing songs like, the worms crawl in, the worms crawl out, the worms play pinochle on your snout. Ew. Uncle Len was right in the middle of one of his best stories, the golden arm. We were all riveted and watching. Nobody noticed in the middle of that story that Uncle Fred had gotten up. Nobody noticed, and even if they did, they thought he was going over behind a tree to relieve himself. The Navy did that to him. Nobody knew that he went back to his cabin by himself. Nobody knew that my Uncle Fred had purchased from a museum store in Chicago a full gorilla suit for our vacation in the haunted town. Nobody knew that he was in his cabin all by himself, putting on that gorilla suit that had a zipper, but the fur hid that zipper so you couldn't see it, and a full-headed mask that came all the way down past the shoulders with real glass eyes that glowed green when the light hit them, real gorilla teeth and a mouth that stuck out and a tongue hanging off the edge of the mask. And he was laughing to himself because he thought this was going to be the best joke he had ever played on us on any of the vacations that we had been on together. He left out of the back door of his cabin kind of snickering in a gorilla kind of way. He came all the way through the woods so that he would come at us from the other side, and even those that thought he had gotten up to relieve himself wouldn't expect him coming from that direction. When he got to the place where the grass met the sand, he got down on all furry fours and started to crawl towards the fire. And when the firelight hit those glass eyes and glowed green, he started growling. My Aunt Ellie launched into the air and let out a blood-curdling scream. 4 of my cousins were running down the beach screaming, "Get away from the gorilla!" Until my Uncle Fred had been satisfied enough to whip that gorilla mask off his head, and he was holding the head of the thing, laughing. And he said, "That was the best joke I've ever played on you." My Aunt Ellie put her hands on her skinny little hips and said, "Fred, we all knew it was you all along." And he said, "Yeah, sure you did." He kept the gorilla suit on for the rest of that night. It was a little cold out and it kept him warm. He took the head of this thing and put it on a log right next to the fire so that for the rest of the evening, the eyes were glowing and that tongue was hanging out. It got late. The oldest and the youngest members of my family went to bed. The teenagers stayed up with Uncle Len, the only uncle who could stay up all night long. I don't know how he did it. The fire had burned down, and so there was just coals glowing in the fire pit. And as it got later that night, we saw her not once, not twice, but 3 times. A young girl about 15, 16 years old, cold night, wearing a sleeveless white cotton summer dress. The first time she walked by us, we said, "Hey, good evening, you on vacation?" She acted like she didn't even see us. She just walked by. I said, "Uncle Len, that's a little weird. She's not very friendly, is she? Leave the girl alone. She's out for a walk." The second time we saw her, she was staring in the windows around our cabins. I'm from Detroit. I said, "Uncle Fred, what is she looking for?" Or Uncle Len, and he said, "Leave the girl alone. She's just curious. She's probably been on vacation with her parents all week and just needs a little break. Leave her alone." The third time we saw her, she had started to wade out into Lake Huron and picked up the long white skirt of her dress, wading out in the water. We thought she was going to dive in and go swimming. And I said, "Uncle Len, you're not supposed to go swimming at night. You're not supposed to be swimming alone. Should we go stop her?" And again he said, "Leave the girl be. She's not doing anything wrong." Eventually, we all went to sleep in our cabins, and I remember laying in that bunk bed with the springs underneath, right? And it took me a long time to go to sleep because I couldn't get the image of that girl out of my mind and wondered who she was and why she was acting so strange. In the middle of the night, we woke up to the screams from my youngest cousins, screaming and running through the woods to the cabin where their parents were sleeping. Woke everybody up, and we followed them to see what was wrong. And when we got to the cabin and the lights had been turned on, they said they swore they heard the voice of a young girl below the window of their cabin. She was crying, they said. She was calling out some name, but they couldn't understand what it was in between the sobs of her crying. We listened to their story. We thought maybe my youngest cousins had heard one too many of Uncle Len's ghost stories that night. And you know how when you're young, your imagination can run away with you? We assured them that there was no girl underneath the window of their cabin. And we took flashlights and walked them around every cabin until they were sure that there was no one there. And when they were satisfied, they went back to sleep on the floor of their parents' cabin. We all went back to our cabins, and I laid down in my bunk again and listened to the wind through the few now white pine trees on the Lake Huron shore and the lapping of the water on the beach, and finally I fell asleep. Because of the commotion the night before, we all got up a little bit later. But when we got up, the fire had already been made and the coffee was already on, and guess who was up? None other than Uncle Fred. First one up. We made our way down to the fire and started to get things around for breakfast when the man who owned the cabins that we had rented pulled up in his truck and got out, and he came down to our fire. We offered him a cup of coffee. He said, I make a habit of coming and visiting all the people who rent from me the morning after they arrive. Just want to see how your first night was. How did it go? We told him we had a great first night. Loved the new place. Loved the cabins and loved the lake. And then we told him about Uncle Fred being a gorilla the night before and how that was a little fun. He walked back to his truck, but before he got in, he turned around and said, well then, Minnie didn't visit you folks last night then, did she? We looked up and said, Minnie who? He said, certainly you know. Most people come here because they know. Our town is haunted by the ghost of a young girl. Her name is Minnie Quay, and she died here years ago, and my guests have seen her, and so have the people of this town over the years. She always appears in a white cotton summer dress, sleeveless. There was a long pause and silence among all the members of my family, until finally we all turned, and almost at the same time we looked at Uncle Fred. First one up, huh? We said, Uncle Fred, and he said, why are you all looking at me? I didn't do anything. We were sure that he had gotten up early that morning, went and talked to the owner, told him about his gorilla stunt the night before, and told him to come over and talk about the girl. For that morning, we had told everybody about the girl we had seen wandering around the cabins and the beach. Well, we started laughing, and we started laughing. And we laughed for a long time after that vacation. Uncle Fred said, I didn't do that. And that girl, just a girl that maybe had been out last night who rented the cabins just north of here. We laughed for a long time about that vacation when Uncle Fred was a gorilla and we thought we saw the ghost girl of Forrester, but it was not many years ago while I stopped laughing. I lived in the town of Hastings, Michigan at the time. My friend Leslie ran the bookstore in our town, and on Wednesdays, if I wasn't traveling to go tell stories somewhere, why, she would ask me to come in and help her put away the new order. The phone rang that day, and Leslie said, can you come on in to help me? And I said, sure, I'm home today. She said, I saved a book out for you. I think you're going to love it. When I got into the bookstore, she handed me a book called Michigan Haunts and Hauntings. It was written by a woman named Marion Cucklow, the same woman who wrote the article in the Free Press when I was in high school, the same article my dad had cut out of the paper that led us to Forrester, Michigan so many years ago. I took the book home, for now she had researched all the haunted sites in the state and wrote stories about them with a map in the back if you wanted to follow it to all the haunted places. I have followed that map. The last story in the book was called The Legend of the Ghost of Minnie Quay. My Uncle Fred may have been a gorilla on vacation that year, but he didn't make up the story about that girl. And I finally found out what happened to her. In 1852, remember the name above the house and the date? In 1852, a man by the name of James Quay, a banker on the East Coast outside of Boston, moved his family to Michigan because his oldest daughter, Luann, had died of leukemia, which was not curable at the time. His wife and family were so grief-stricken that he thought it might do them good to make a brand new and fresh start. At the peak of the lumber era in Michigan, James Quay saw business possibilities in a place called Michigan. He moved the family to the boomtown, lumber town of Forrester, Michigan in 1852. When they moved into the two-story wooden house next to the Tanner House Hotel, he put the year that they had moved in above the door and the family name Quay, hoping that this home would bring happier memories than the ones they left behind. Minnie was the oldest daughter now after her sister Luann had died. There were 5 other younger Quay children younger than her. When they moved into the house, Minnie was 14 years old. in a lumber town. The greatest action in those days was when a ship would come in. In the early days, the sailing ships, but at that time, you started to see steamers pulling up to that pier in Forester to load with lumber and ship out. And when a ship came in and set anchor, the sailors would be coming off of those ships. 14 years old, Minnie was not unlike the other young girls in her town. When one of those ships came in, she and her girlfriends would all go down to the waterfront and watch the sailors coming off of those ships. Minnie saw one young man come off of that ship, and she fell in love with him right away. None of the stories indicate that anyone remembers his name, but he must have been handsome and rugged after 3 years of life on one of those ships. To Minnie, it sounded like he had seen the world, for he had been to places like Detroit, Chicago, and Sault Ste. Marie. And it doesn't take long for news to spread through a small town. And news came back to Minnie's parents that she had been seen all alone with that sailor. She had been seen down on the end of the pier sitting with him, no one else around. She had been seen holding hands with him and walking along the beach. And you can't blame her parents for being worried. She was only 14 years old, and to be in a relationship with a sailor was not something they wanted for her at that age. One night when she came home later than she was supposed to, a great argument broke out in that 2-story house where they lived. She was forbidden to ever see him again. Her mother told her, "Minnie Quay, I would rather see you dead than married to a no-good sailor, and you will not see him again." The next morning, Minnie tried to sneak out of the house, run down so that she could say goodbye to the sailor that she loved one last time, but her mother caught her halfway down to the pier and grabbed her by the elbow and yanked her back home. And so she never had a chance to say goodbye to him the last time he left Forester. That spring, news came to Forester that after the ice had broken, one of the ships had sunk in a storm out on Lake Huron. And on the ship that had sunk was that sailor that Minnie had fallen in love with. And when news came to Forester and she heard that, it was more than she could bear. She had never been able to say goodbye to him the last time he left town. A few days later, after she received the news, her mother and father loaded up all the younger Quay children to go on an all-day trip for supplies in Port Sanilac, leaving Minnie home with the youngest, her little baby brother Charles, who was only 1 year old and needed to take a nap that afternoon. When Charles went down for his nap, it was an unusually warm spring day. Minnie left the house wearing a light white cotton summer dress, sleeveless. Charles was sleeping quietly in the house when she made her way down to the streets of Forester to the pier. Such a warm spring day, all the older men in town had taken their place in the rocking chairs on the back porch of the Tanner House Hotel. They waved at Minnie when they saw her, thinking she was just out for a walk. They watched her as she made her way down to the end of that pier, and they could do nothing to stop her as she dove into the icy cold spring waters of Lake Huron. They couldn't get to her in time, and Minnie Quay drowned in those waters. You see, she was just trying to be joined back together with that sailor that she loved so much. But fate was not kind. They were never joined back together. And the old man on the Tanner House porch for weeks and months talked about that young girl and how sad it was that she ended her life in that way. And if they could only have talked to her to tell her that she would love again, that this wouldn't be the end of her life. But it was. Sadly enough, the Quay family had to bury their second oldest daughter in the cemetery of Forester. But the people of Forester will tell you that she is not at rest. No, Minnie Quay is not at rest, or so the people of Forester say. Her ghost still wanders those lonely shores, and if you go there, you may see her even to this day. That's a story called The Ghost of Minnie Quay. Thank you. I want to end our time tonight by thanking you for coming and hearing the stories that I had to share this evening. There's more, of course. Maybe we can gather again at some other time. I want to share with you the special way in which the family who told stories around this lamp would blow it out at the end of a long night of stories. Their mother would look up and say, "It's time for us to go to bed," and most of the youngest ones had already fallen asleep with quilts thrown over them. And they would make a wish, but not for themselves. On those nights of stories, they would make a wish for somebody else, for they believed when they blew this candle out, their wishes would be delivered to the person that they were sending them to. Many of their relatives still in Finland would be the subject of those wishes. So I'd like you to make a wish tonight for somebody you care about. And when you're ready, you can look up here at me. And when everyone has had a chance to make a wish, I'll blow this story lamp out. But I will also say that even though we're blowing it out, the stories are not over. Not if we keep telling them over and over again. So those stories that connect us from the past will help guide us into the future in a good way. Let's make a wish.